Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what is rapidly becoming one of the worst economic and humanitarian crises anywhere in the world right now. Cuba, an island nation of almost 10 million people, which sits just 90 miles from the United States, is literally running out of electricity, fuel, food and money all at the same time. Over the last 48 hours, huge parts of the country have gone completely dark. Entire provinces have no power. Havana has suffered a 24-hour blackout. The water systems are failing, fuel stations are empty, hotels are shutting down, flights have been cancelled, and hospitals are now relying on emergency generators. And perhaps the most shocking part of all has come with Cuba's own energy minister going on national television and admitting publicly, "We have no fuel, we have no diesel." And think about that for a second. A government official announcing to its population that the country has effectively run out of energy. And the really important point here is that this isn't just a temporary technical problem. This is the culmination of decades of economic dependency, political isolation, collapsing infrastructure, and a financial system that is now running on fumes. So in today's video, I want to walk you through exactly how Cuba got here, what's happening right now, and why this crisis may still get significantly worse. But before we get into the details of all of that, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed to please hit that red subscriber button? It really does help me with the algorithm and also puts a smile on my face. And if you want to make sure that you don't miss future videos, please hit that notification bell. To fully understand why this is happening in Cuba, we need to go back briefly to the Cuban Revolution. Before Fidel Castro took power in 1959, Cuba's economy was deeply connected to the United States. American businesses had huge investments all across the island, from hotels and oil refineries to sugar production and infrastructure. But after Castro introduced communism and nationalized foreign-owned assets, relations with Washington collapsed. The United States imposed a trade embargo, Cuba lost access to American trade and finance, and Havana turned instead to the Soviet Union for survival. That decision shaped Cuba's entire modern economy. The Soviets supplied oil, fuel and financial support for decades. Cuba's electricity grid was built around Soviet-era oil-fired power stations, and for years that system worked, as long as subsidized oil kept arriving. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. Cuba entered what became known as the Special Period, a devastating economic crisis marked by shortages, blackouts and hunger. Eventually, Venezuela stepped in under Hugo Chavez and began supplying huge quantities of cheap oil, effectively replacing the Soviet Union as Cuba's financial lifeline. But here's the critical point. Cuba never fundamentally reformed its economy or modernized its infrastructure. It simply swapped one external dependency for another. And now, with Venezuelan supplies collapsing and new US sanctions tightening the screws, the entire system is breaking down. And what's happening right now is genuinely extraordinary. Earlier this week, Cuba's national electricity grid suffered another major collapse, leaving huge areas of the country completely without power. Entire eastern provinces went dark simultaneously, stretching from Guantanamo all the way across to Ciego de Avila. And authorities admitted they have no clear timeline for restoration. In Havana itself, residents have endured full 24-hour periods without electricity, not rolling blackouts, not scheduled outages, entire days without power. This is happening repeatedly, and the scale of the problem is enormous. Cuba needs somewhere in the region of 3,000 to 3,500 megawatts of electricity during peak evening demand, but current generation levels have repeatedly fallen to around 1,200 megawatts. In simple terms, the country is producing barely 1/3 of the electricity it actually needs. 9 thermal generation units are currently offline because of breakdowns and fuel shortages. Many of these facilities are decades old and operating far beyond their intended lifespan. And when the electricity fails, everything else starts failing too. Water pumps stop working, refrigeration systems collapse, food spoils, businesses shut, internet and communications become unreliable and unavailable, hospitals move onto emergency generators. Imagine trying to sleep in tropical heat without electricity, without fans, without air conditioning, without reliable water, and with no idea when the power is coming back on. That is now daily life for millions of Cubans. But I think the moment that really showed how serious this crisis has become happened earlier this week on Cuban state television. Cuba's Ministry of Energy and Mines, Vicente de la Olivey, appeared publicly and admitted, "We have absolutely no fuel or diesel." And he repeated it for emphasis. "We do not have any fuel, we do not have any diesel." That is an astonishing statement. A sovereign government effectively admitting it's run out of energy supplies. And the reason that this matters so much economically is because modern economies cannot function without reliable energy. If electricity disappears, transport stops. If transport stops, supply chains fail. If supply chains fail, food disappears from shelves, businesses close, tourism collapses, tax revenues disappear, currency collapses, and eventually the entire economic system starts shutting down piece by piece. And that is exactly what we're now seeing in Cuba. Domestic oil production only covers around 40% of the country's needs. The remainder always has to be imported. But Cuba's imports have collapsed. Oil shipments from Venezuela have fallen dramatically over recent years. Mexico also sharply reduced supplies after increased pressure and sanctions threats from the United States. Russian oil shipments have provided temporary relief, but nowhere near enough to stabilise the country. And according to reports, the latest Russian tanker deliveries have themselves been delayed. So Cuba is now desperately trying to source fuel from almost anywhere it can. But there's another huge problem here. Cuba doesn't have the hard currency to pay the global market prices for energy anymore. Tourism, the country's largest source of foreign currency, is itself collapsing. And this is having devastating knock-on effects across the country. Tourism in Cuba has been hit incredibly hard over the last few years. Airlines have cancelled or reduced flights because of fuel shortages and operational disruption. Some tourists have found themselves stranded. Hotels have shut entire sections of their property to conserve electricity and diesel for generators. And for ordinary Cubans who rely on tourism income, the impact has been brutal. Private guest houses, restaurants, taxi drivers, tour guides and small businesses are all struggling. Some businesses can't operate because refrigeration systems fail during blackouts. Others simply have no customers. And remember, for many Cubans working in tourism, income from foreign visitors represented one of the ways to access hard currency and maintain a decent standard of living. Now, even that is disappearing. And the broader economic figures are incredibly bleak. Cuba's economy shrank again last year. The country has now suffered multiple consecutive years of contraction. The Cuban peso has effectively collapsed on informal markets. Average salaries when converted into US dollars at real market exchange rates are now often worth little more than a few dollars per month. Pensions have become almost meaningless in real purchasing power. And perhaps most astonishingly of all, Cuba's sugar industry, once one of the most important and successful in the world, has now fallen to production levels not seen for more than 2 centuries. In fact, Cuba is now importing sugar. At the same time, huge numbers of people are leaving the country. Since 2019, well over 1 million Cubans are estimated to have emigrated. And when large numbers of young, working-age people leave an already struggling economy, the pressure on the system becomes even worse. Now, Cuba is trying to respond. One of the few genuinely positive developments has been a major expansion in solar energy, backed heavily by China. China has been supplying solar panels, investment and infrastructure support, and Cuba has rapidly increased renewable generation over the past 12 months. But there is a major limitation. Solar power helps during the day, but Cuba's biggest electricity demand comes at night. And without enormous battery storage systems, which are extremely expensive, solar alone cannot stabilise the grid. So once the sun goes down, the country still faces the same underlying problem. The old oil-fired power stations don't have enough fuel to maintain stable generation, and the result is repeated national blackouts. And obviously the blockade that's been put in place by Donald Trump, where he's basically stopping ships going to Cuba, is making the situation worse. So where does this leave Cuba right now? Well, honestly, in a very dangerous position, because this is no longer just an economic slowdown or a temporary energy shortage. This is starting to look like systemic national breakdown. And whatever your politics, whatever your views on communism, the embargo, sanctions, or the blockade, or the Cuban government itself, the reality on the ground is that millions of ordinary people are now living through extraordinarily difficult conditions. Days without electricity, food shortages, transport disruption, water shortages, collapsing incomes, and growing uncertainty about what happens next. And ultimately, this is what makes the Cuban situation so dangerous, because when populations lose electricity, lose food security, lose transport, lose income, and lose hope all at the same time, history shows that societies can become extremely unstable very quickly. Cuba now appears to be approaching that point, and unless something changes soon, financially, politically, or geopolitically, this crisis may still be in its early stages. So I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments as and when they occur, but hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, or maybe you didn't like the content but you thought it was interesting, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already,